and welcome to Ye Olde Bestsellers Book Club, where I am reading through some of America's earliest best-selling novels, as reported by The Bookman, a literary magazine of the 1890s. Today's book is Sentimental Tommy by author and playwright J.M. Barrie, who is much better known for being the creator of Peter Pan. But Sentimental Tommy predates the publication of any of the Peter Pan stories by several years, and he was, even at this point, already known in some literary circles. Much of Sentimental Tommy takes place in a Scottish town called Thrums, which kind of exists. It's very much inspired by Kirriemuir, which is the place where Barrie grew up, and this is not the only work of his that is centered around Thrums, or inspired by his own family and home. Sentimental Tommy begins, quote, "The celebrated Tommy first comes into view on a dirty London stair, and he was in sexless garments, which were all he had, and he was 5. So, though we are looking at him, we must do it sideways, lest he sit down hurriedly to hide them." End quote. It is very embarrassing to not have pants. Quote, "His home was at the top of a house of 4 floors, and here he had lived with his mother since his father's death 6 months ago. This stair was nursery to all the children whose homes opened on it. Not so safe as nurseries in the part of London that is chiefly inhabited by boys in sailor suits, but preferable as a centre of adventure." End quote. On the stairs with Tommy is his friend Shovel, a boy who is 2 years older and who only has one eye, because we're starting with a child abuse warning. Once, Shovel's very alcoholic but sometimes good-natured mother was, quote, "giving to him pretty strong with the tongs. His father had struck her and told her to drop it, and then Shovel sauced his father for interfering, saying she should lick him as long as she bloomin' well liked, which made his father go for him with a dog collar, and that was how Shovel lost his eye." End quote. Very healthy family environments up in here. On the stairs, quote, "An odd figure in that house, a gentleman, passed them without a word, so desirous was he to make a breath taken at the foot of the closed stair last him to the top." "It's a kid or a coffin," Shovel said sharply, knowing that only birth or death brought a doctor here. End quote. And then they watch the doctor enter the room that Tommy shares with his mother. Quote, "Is she a debtor?" Shovel asked, brightening, for funerals made a pleasant stir on the stair. End quote. Tommy's not quite sure what that means, because he's 5, but he can tell it would really raise his reputation among the other kids if his mom was a debtor, because it would be exciting, so he hopes she is. But no, Shovel's convinced it's just a stupid kid, and so Tommy asks him when the kid will arrive. It can't have shown up yet, because he's been sitting here on the stairs. He would have seen the kid come in. Quote, "Before he could control himself, Shovel blurted out, 'Do you think as they come in on their feet?' 'How then?' demanded Tommy, but Shovel had exhausted his knowledge of the subject." End quote. Tommy decides he's going to go guard the window, so if his new sibling tries to come in that way, he can shove them back out. But then a girl wanders inside, around his age, and he decides that that must be his new sibling. So he convinces her to come with him and takes her out into the city, hoping to find another family he can get her to go home with, so she won't intrude on his. He accidentally gives her to her own mother, so it's fine. When he gets back from this, feeling very triumphant, Shovel crushes his hopes and dreams by declaring that it had come. Surely this can't be true, Tommy thinks. He disposed of it appropriately. That girl can't have snuck back in, but he goes and listens at the door and hears, indeed, a child inside. Though he later discovers not the girl from earlier. This child is much smaller and less competent. He tries to convince his mom that they could probably sneak out with all their furniture while this stupid baby is sleeping and just leave her here, but for some reason, Ma isn't convinced. His new sister's name is Elspeth, and while at first Tommy wants nothing to do with her, as some time passes, she gets a little older, they spend more time together, alone at home, when their mother, quote, whose health was failing through frequent attacks of bronchitis, end quote, gets too sick to carry Elspeth along to work anymore, and a reluctant sibling attachment starts to form. Quote, "On the whole, he thought he might make something of her if only she were longer," end quote. He tries to teach her to walk and eventually has some success using some dog training techniques he learned by watching his neighbor. He also teaches her to speak, and when she gets big enough, to toddle down the stairs to read the alphabet, collecting new letters by wandering the streets together hunting for signs to read. Quote, she bagged new letters daily. Y's are found easily when you know where to look for them. They hang on behind. X's are never found singly, but often 3 at a time. Q is so aristocratic that even Tommy had only heard of it. On the other hand, big A and little e were so dirt cheap that these two scholars passed them with something like a sneer. End quote. At age 4, Elspeth is very sweet and aggressively religious, and prone to bouts of involuntary prayer whenever she feels like she's done something wrong, or more often, when Tommy has done something wrong. Now, Tommy doesn't know too much about the life his mother comes from, or much about his father, who he barely remembers besides the fact that when he died, his mother clapped her hands together with joy. He knows that though they now live in London, his mom is from Thrums, a town up in Scotland that she's told him lots of stories about, and that he has been obsessed with for all of his childhood. He thinks it must be the most beautiful, wonderful, magical place ever. At one point, he discovers a whole street in London, not that far from where they live, full of people who are also from Thrums, but his ma tells him he is never, ever allowed to go there. Eventually, though, she agrees. Okay, he can go, as long as he doesn't tell anyone his last name, and he lets them believe he's just some boy from London. So Tommy starts spending a decent amount of time there. He makes some friends, and starts collecting lots of gossip that he can report back to his mother about people that she used to know. One of the people he hears a lot about is a woman named Jean Miles, who had some sort of failed tragic romance with a man named Aaron Latta that left him a broken, miserable recluse and saw her leaving town married to Magerful Tam. Jean sends letters to the people from Thrums sometimes about her life now, how she's living wealthy in London, dressing her children in fine velvet. Everyone kind of hates her for her success. Now, Tommy's mother has never really stopped being sick. Sometimes she does okay, sometimes she can only keep her job because Shovel's mother is willing to cover her shifts, and it's only getting worse. Often she coughs all through the night, while their neighbor angrily taps on the shared wall between them to complain about the noise. Quote, Tommy knew what death was now, and Elspeth knew its name, and both were vaguely aware that it was looking for their mother. End quote. When it reaches the point that she can barely get out of bed, she confesses to her children that she is Jean Miles. And later that night, quote, Mrs. Sandys took Tommy into bed with her, and while Elspeth slept, told him the story of her life. She coughed feebly now, but the panting of the dying is a sound that no walls can cage, and the man continued to remonstrate at intervals. Tommy never recalled his mother's story without seeming through the darkness in which it was told to hear Elspeth's peaceful breathing and the angry tap-tap on the wall. End quote. And here, I'm going to do a quick pre-apology. I am not going to attempt a Scottish accent, but I am going to read the words as they are written. And when Tommy's mom is talking, that means behind is height and together is thegither, etc. It probably sounds stupid coming out of my particular mouth, but it's not like I don't sound stupid anyways. Also, not in this bit specifically, but in general, there's a decent smattering of Scots words in this book. Ken instead of no, greet instead of cry. Most of them are pretty easy to figure out in context, so I'm not going to pause to address them every time they come up. If there's a word in a quote that sounds weird to you, it is probably for one of these two reasons. Tommy's mother met his father Tom for the first time at a small-town ball, and she knew he was a bad man, but still found herself drawn to him. Quote, we danced together and fought together all through the ball, but my will was no match for his, and the worst of it was I had a kind of secret pleasure in being mastered. End quote. Tom kissed her that night, and she smacked him, quote, but behind the redness that came o'er his face, I saw his triumphing laugh, and he whispered that he liked me for the blow. He said, I prefer the swear ones, and the more you struggle, my beauty, the better pleased I'll be. End quote. Jean already has a pretty steady courtship with another man, Aaron Latta, and one night the two of them are in the woods together, near town, where young lovers often go. Quote, Aaron wrote with a stick on the ground, Jean Latta. We were so ta'en up with ourselves that we saw nobody coming, and all at once there was your father by the side of us. You've written the wrong name, Aaron. It should be Jean Sandys. End quote. Tom nearly rewrites the name himself, but then he has a better idea. He tells Aaron to do it for him. And, quote, Aaron did it. He was loath, but your father crushed him to the ground and said do what he should, and warned him, too, that if he did it, he would lose me, bantering and cowing him and advising him not to shame me all in a breath. If Aaron had fought and been beaten, even if he had just lain there and let the man strike away, if he had done anything except what he was bidden, he would have won, for it would have broken your father's power over me. But to write that word, it was like dishonoring me to save his own skin. Without a look behind me, away I went with my master, and I had no more will to resist him. And oh, man, when I came to myself the next morning, I wished I had never been born. End quote. So she slept with Tom, and is now in a position where she has to convince him to marry her, rather than, quote, wait by myself in Thrums for what might happen, and me a single woman, end quote. She can't risk possibly having a child unmarried. He knows how desperate she is, and enjoys toying with her for a while, stringing her anxiously along. Meanwhile, the entire town has taken this whole situation as a personal insult. Aaron has shamed them, Jean has shamed them, quote, the more they miscalled me, the higher I held my head, and I hung on your father's arm as if I adored him, and I boasted about his office and his clerk in London, till they believed what I did not believe a word of myself, end quote. Tom does eventually agree to marry her, and Aaron Latta comes to their wedding all in black to witness the death of Jean Miles. Tom has always acted like he has money. He's very quick to spend what he has, and just as quick to lie about where it came from. Jean leaves everyone in Thrums convinced that he'll be able to give her a very comfortable life. She writes those letters to people back home talking about all the luxury she and her children are living in, so that at least the people who mistreated her and talked shit about her will envy her. That revenge is the one pleasure she has in life, because Tom is not wealthy. There is no luxury, just a man that she has hated since before they were married, who then died and left her with 2 children she sometimes can't afford to feed. Tommy's mother tells him she hopes Elspeth is young enough to forget about her, so she might have a bright, carefree childhood. But one day, when she's older, when she's married, quote, tell her, man, how you and me spent this night. Look at me, Tommy, look long, so as you'll be able to call up my face as it was on the far back night when I told you my mournful story. You cannot see in the dark, but hold my hand so that when you tell Elspeth you'll mind how hot it was, and the skin loose on it, and put your hand on my cheeks and feel how wet they are with sorrowful tears, and if she greets for her mother a whiley, let her greet. The sobbing boy hugged his mother. Do you think I'm an old woman? She said to him. You're guy old, are you no? I'm guy old. I'm 29. End quote. Only 17 the day she met Tommy's father. Also, Tommy is now, 11. Not long after, a letter arrives in Thrums, written by Jean Sandys for Aaron Latta. Not to Aaron Latta. He would burn that letter before reading it, but the blacksmith relays to him a message. Jean Sandys is dying, her children will be left alone, and she begs Aaron to come to London. And though he is very conflicted, he does. And not long after, he returns to Thrums with 2 children and a dead body. Elspeth isn't allowed to attend her own mother's funeral, because in this part of Scotland only men get to go to those. And dead women, technically. As Tommy walks back from watching the burial, quote, whether his eyes were open or shut, what he saw was his mother being shut up in a black hole and trying forever and ever to get out, end quote. The children have one thing to look forward to, though. They are finally in Thrums, the magical fairyland of their childhood that they grew up hearing those stories about. They are so excited to explore. But Thrums is not fairyland. It is cold and muddy, the buildings are ugly and small, the church, which Tommy had always bragged to the London children was, quote, bigger and lovelier than St. Paul's, well, it is a different style of architecture, and had Elspeth not been there with tears in waiting, Tommy would have blubbered. It's littler than I thought, end quote. Even its minister is disappointingly small. They try to stay cheerful, pointing out tiny details and pretending to admire them. What a nice barrel that is, Tommy. What a lovely wall. Quote, sometimes Elspeth would stoop hastily, pretending that she wanted to tie her bootlace, but really to brush away a tear, and there were moments when Tommy hung very limp. Each was trying to deceive the other for the other's sake, and one of them was never good at deception. They saw through each other, yet kept up the chilly game because they could think of nothing better, and perhaps the game was worth playing, for love invented it." End quote. Aaron is very much a bachelor in lifestyle. His house is a mess, and though many women in town have offered to do some housekeeping for him now that he has children, he turns them all down. Quote, "Had Elspeth, at the age of 6, now settled down to domestic duties, she would not have been the youngest housekeeper ever known in Thrums, but she was never very good at doing things, only at loving and being loved." End quote. I do think the author kind of hates Elspeth. A little bit. Hate is the wrong word. He just thinks she's stupid. There are several comments throughout comparing her to Tommy that, to be fair, I don't think you're supposed to take all that seriously, and they might also be making fun of Tommy, but still, quote, "Tommy's grief was the more heartrending. He was so much better at everything than Elspeth," or, quote, "Though her remorse was but a poor display beside his, he was so much better at everything than Elspeth," end quote. This is not helped by the fact that all Elspeth does for the entire rest of the book is pray and talk about how wonderful Tommy is. They are honestly, at this point, so tightly bonded that it's getting unhealthy. Being away from Tommy for any amount of time always makes Elspeth upset. He is literally her only hobby, and he cannot stand it when she is acting unhappy. If all other avenues fail, he starts regularly threatening that he will literally die if she doesn't become happy on command. He mimes cutting his own throat. He does this often enough that it stops being effective. Anyway, housekeeping. Tommy tries to take care of the house himself, but Aaron says he's not allowed because, quote, "It's an ill thing for menfolk to ken ower muckle about women's work," end quote. This isn't a rule that Aaron applies to himself. It is not his excuse for being a grunge monster. He theoretically could do housework if he actually felt like it, because he doesn't even consider himself a man anymore ever since that incident with Tom. He talks about it a lot. I guess you're a coward one time and your whole sausage falls off. Aaron has issues. He also doesn't parent these children. He's not harsh with them, but he does just kind of ignore them. Though he does get them enrolled in school, which is better than nothing. Tommy does make some friends around town. One is a girl named Grizzle, who he befriends sort of against her will. It starts very antagonistic. She lives alone with her mother, who is known around town only as the Painted Lady. Quote, "She was a little woman, brightly dressed, so fragile that a collie might have knocked her over with his tail, and she had a beautiful white and pink face, the white ending of a sudden in the middle of her neck, where it met skin of a duller color," end quote. The local children treat the Painted Lady like the boogeyman. They play games, goading each other into getting as close to her house as they can at night, and always end up running away in terror. Grizzle, they just treat like dirt. Groups of kids will follow her around, throwing things, teasing. Quote, "What's a father?" was their favorite jeer, because she had once innocently asked this question of a false friend, end quote. Tommy starts giving her self-defense lessons in the woods, teaching her such useful tips as always hit with your thumbs closed inside your fists, the best way to punch people. And as they get closer, she becomes more and more open, and she shares more about her mother, who is complicated. Usually, the Painted Lady seems sweet, quiet, unassuming. She has viciously cussed out the local blacksmith for basically no reason, and she's always sending Grizzle out to buy her brandy, but usually sweet and quiet. Sometimes, though, Grizzle says she speaks to a man, and Tommy asks who, and she says, quote, "I don't know, but you've seen him." "No, he is not there." "Not there? How can she speak to him if he's not there?" "She thinks he is there. He comes on a horse." "What's the horse like?" "There is no horse." "But you said she just thinks there's a horse. She hears it. Did you ever hear it?" "No," end quote. And when the Painted Lady hears this horse, she'll go out for walks in the night with the man who isn't there. Grizzle thinks he might be her father, that her mom spent years searching for before she gave up a while ago, and now she just forgets sometimes that he's not around anymore. One night, Tommy and Elspeth end up outside their house, watching through the window, for reasons that would take far too long to explain, and they witness one of these episodes. At first, it's a calm, happy, domestic scene, Grizzle and her mother content in each other's company. Then the painted lady gets quiet and still and clearly confused, like she doesn't know where she is or who Grizzle is. She gets afraid. They watch Grizzle try to soothe her, to explain. It kind of works until she starts shaking violently. Quote, Grizzle went to her mother and took loving hold of her, and the woman clung to her child in a way pitiful to see. She still shivered as if in a deadly chill, and her feet rattled on the floor, and her arms against the sides of the chair. Grizzle pinned the trembling arms with her own and twisted her legs round her mother's, and still the painted lady's tremors shook them both. The shivering slowly lessened and at last ceased, but this seemed to make Grizzle no less unhappy. The painted lady was hearkening intently for some sound other than Grizzle's voice, and only once did she look at her child. Then it was with cruel, ugly eyes, and at the same moment she shoved Grizzle aside so viciously that it was almost a blow. What was she listening for so eagerly? Was it for the gallop of a horse? End quote. She calms down again, but she's not settled. She's pretending to be, trying to act casual while she sneaks around the house, doing her hair, painting her face, dressing up. She thinks she's being very subtle and getting away with it. Meanwhile, Grizzle sits on the floor hugging a doll to her chest, pretending not to notice what's going on. And after her mother has snuck out the window like a disobedient teenager off into the night, Grizzle calmly gathers up something warm to wrap her in and follows slowly after her. There is another person in town that Tommy has an enemies-to-friends sort of relationship with, and his name is Corp. Corp is a little older than Tommy and has maybe one brain cell. He's not bright, and he is also physically upsetting to read about. These things both made me squirm. Viewer discretion is advised. One of the first things we learn about him is that his favorite candy from the town's annual festival is the one that's so sticky it literally yanks out at least 2 of his teeth, and I feel like he's definitely too old for those to come back. And also, quote, his hands were covered with warts, which he had a trick of biting till they bled. Then he rubbed them on his trousers, end quote, which are covered in quarry dust from his work, which is just multiple layers of heebie-jeebies. I actually had to put the book down here because I was squirming and my hands started twitching. I don't care if you have warty hands, but please don't chew on them and then rub rock dust all up in your open wounds. Also, his name isn't actually Corp. People just call him that because he gets fits where he lay like one dead. So I guess it's Corp, like corpse, which I feel like we're bullying. At this point, a large chunk of the story becomes devoted to detailed accounts of the elaborate childhood games that Tommy, Elspeth, Grizzle, Corp, and occasionally others play in the woods and around town. They have a little lair with some makeshift furniture. Tommy concocts elaborate plots and overarching stories. They each take on different characters, often several, and play through these pre-scripted scenes. Muddy fields become oceans where grand heroes land their ships. Prisoners are made to walk the plank. There are sword fights and disguises and political intrigue. I did find a lot of this charming, even though it feels like one of the more pointless stretches of the story. Something I think this book does really well is really look at things from the point of view of the children. Their chaotic nonsense logic, their way of understanding or not understanding how the world works, both while they're playing and also while trying to comprehend some pretty grim, serious adult struggles of death and illness and poverty. That childish lens that everything is seen through is, I think, my favorite part of the whole story. I like how it was crafted. Around here, we also get a monologue by the painted lady. It's the only time she actually gets to talk much. And first off, so painted lady. Generally, I think that phrase implies a sex worker, which she is, almost certainly. There's a few, as Grizzle puts it, bad men who used to come see her at night, although at some point Grizzle says that stopped. And she has money in the bank that no one really knows where it comes from. So I don't know if the townsfolk, though, call her the Painted Lady because they are accusing her of this line of work, or if it's because she does just literally paint her face. We know they look down on her for that, on top of having a child outside of wedlock. who I don't think is a product of that kind of work, regardless, and this comes back to her speech. The painted lady, in the grip of one of her delusions, runs into Elspeth and talks to her a bit about the man who never comes, from when they were actually together. Quote, "He kissed me, and I pretended to be angry and ran away, but I was not angry. I wanted so to be good, but it is so difficult to refuse when you love him very much, don't you think? It would be so nice, would it not, if they liked us to be good? I think it would be sweet. But they don't, you know, it bores them. Never bore them, and they are so easily bored. It bores them if you say you want to be married. They give you everything else, but if you say you want a wedding, they stamp their feet and go away. Why are you crying, girl? If you cry, you lose your complexion, and then they don't love you anymore. When they don't want to come anymore, they write you a letter, and you run with it to your room and kiss it because you don't know what's inside. Then you open it, and that breaks your heart, you know." End quote. She also says she doesn't understand how some women could do such a thing as painting their faces, so I would assume she only became a painted lady in either sense after being left by Grizel's father. There are also several chapters around this point devoted to a whole side quest about Tommy's middle-aged schoolteacher, who is also his half-aunt on his father's side. We go into her whole backstory, her father's affair that resulted in Tommy's dad, her probably unhealthy level of devotion to her sister, a sort of love affair that her sister had with this guy who then went abroad, so they wrote letters, but then her sister dies, but the teacher doesn't tell the guy because she's afraid he'll stop writing, so she's writing, pretending to be her dead sister, and then now in the present, he comes to town and finds out and forgives her for her years of deception. They get married, the end. It was very tangential. I did like parts of it, but I can't talk about it anymore because I am trying to make an episode less than 50 minutes long, and I am already not winning. One day, Grizel asks Tommy, quote, "Do you know what it means when there are red spots in your cheeks that used not to be there, and if when you cough you bring up a tiny speck of blood?" "I would get a bottle for the doctor," said Tommy evasively. "She won't have the doctor," answered Grizel, end quote. She tries to stop by the doctor's to at least talk to him, but he's in a bad mood and snaps at her, so she doesn't tell him that something's going on with her mother. But she asks him a lot of questions. How do you know if someone's dying? What do you do if they are? Will they know it themselves? And if not, should you tell them? She also starts helping out with a man in town who's on his deathbed. The doctor teaches her a little bit about nursing, and she's very good at that. But the doctor does think she's very weird and morbid, because what could cause such sudden interest besides a dark, twisted fixation? If something else was going on, he would surely sense it. This child is broken. A while later, quote, "In the small hours of the night, the pulse of Thrums stopped for a moment, and then went on again, and the people rose in the morning without knowing that they had lost one of their number while they slept," end quote. It isn't until a whole day has gone by, and evening has fallen again, that Tommy, Corp, Elspeth, and some adults find a grim scene in their forest lair. Quote, "What they saw had best be described very briefly. A fire was burning in the corner of the lair, and in front of it, partly covered with a sheet, lay the painted lady dead. Grizel stood beside the body guarding it, her hands clenched, her eyes very strange. 'You shan't touch her,' she cried passionately, and repeated it many times. She had feared for a long time that her mamma was dying of consumption, but she told no one because everybody was against her and her mamma. And sometimes she used to get so much better that Grizel hoped she would live a long time, but that hope never lasted long," end quote. Her mom had gone walking to the den looking for the man like she often did. Grizel followed after her, lit a fire in the lair to try to keep her warm, but she fell asleep and just never woke up again. Quote, "Through the long Saturday she sat by the side of the body, helpless and unable to cry. She knew that it could not remain there much longer, but every time she rose to go and confess, fear of the indignities to which the body of her darling mamma might be subjected pulled her back," end quote. There have been kids around town joking that her mother is too bad a person for a proper burial, that her corpse will be staked through the heart, and Grizel's afraid that might actually happen. The horrible doctor scolds her, quote, "Think shame of yourself," he thundered, "for keeping me in the dark." And of course she took his words literally, though their full meaning was, "I shall scorn myself from this hour for not having won the poor child's confidence," end quote. And they go on to argue kind of viciously because the doctor is mad at himself and coping terribly, calling this grieving child names like dour brat and most exasperating lassie, and saying she's unnatural, and then turning around and acting annoyed because she's endearing herself to him, and he's starting to think of taking her in, and that's her fault. Quote, I question if I'll get an hour's sleep tonight for thinking of you. I don't want you to think of me. He groaned, oh, what could an untidy, hardened old single man like me do with you in his house? Oh, you little limmer, to put such a thought into my head. I never did. You brat, you willful brat, don't pretend ignorance. You set a trap to catch me, and— Oh, cried Grizzle, and she opened the door quickly. Go away, you horrid man. End quote. Yes, please, I need him to stop. Thankfully, at least Grizzle's mother does get a proper burial in the cemetery like anyone else, though because Grizzle is female, the one person in life who loved the Painted Lady cannot attend her funeral. Way to go, Scotland. The town is now left with the question, what do we do with Grizzle? She's too young to be left alone in the house, although honestly, she did all the housework and was basically head of household already. I think she would be fine, but whatever. On the other hand, no one wants to take her in, mostly due to her being a child of shame with fundamentally bad blood. And the horrible doctor starts doing a lot of thinking. He has a maid right now. She's, quote, the ideal woman for a bachelor's house. When she saw him coming, she fled, guiltily concealing the hated duster. When he roared at her for announcing that dinner was ready, she left him to eat it half cold. When he spilled matches on the floor and then stepped upon them and set the rug on fire, she let him tell her that she should be more careful. End quote. Why is this man the doctor? He thinks he couldn't possibly have Grizzle in the house. All that womanly energy would certainly reignite his maid's innate feminine intolerance to living in a horrible, sticky, apparently flaming bachelor pad, and it would ruin her. And what would he do with a child? Who is he to raise a child? And to that I say, probably the wrong person. But he just can't stop thinking about her, and no one else is taking her, so he goes and offers to take her in. And Grizzle is understandably resistant. But he soothes her biggest fear. Some people have been trying to convince her that her father, wherever he is, might hear about the Painted Lady's death and come get her, and she is terrified that she might be forced to go with him. But the doctor promises he won't let her father take her unless she wants to go, so she agrees to go home with him. And I want to find it sweet because they both seem happy. She becomes his housekeeper, the maid is never mentioned again, and Grizzle enjoys fussing over him and his clothes and his home, trying to keep him clean and respectable, as a doctor should be without the influence of a 13-year-old. She's very alone in the world, and he's an old bachelor with no one else to love him, no, quote, womankind to look after him, end quote, I twitch. They both appreciate having someone to love. I just wish he didn't make me taste puke in the back of my throat a little bit. She also becomes very worried about becoming like her mother. Everyone is telling her lately that there is an innate badness in her blood, and she wants to know what that means, and why, and what can she do about it, and can she cut it out with a knife, because the doctor says he can't do it for her. She's told that if she tries very hard, she may keep the badness dormant, but the most likely thing to awaken it would be a bad man. But how is she to know a bad man when she sees him? Quote, if she likes him and fears him at one breath, and has a sort of secret dread that he's getting a power over her that she cannot resist, end quote, in a word, like Tommy's father was, a masterful man. Quote, a strange thing happened, for she began to draw back from Tommy with a look of terror on her face. I think you are masterful, end quote. She's had a resistance in their little story games. She didn't want her character to be married to his. She wouldn't kiss his hand. She thinks maybe a part of her feared him because it knew he could have power over her. He could be masterful. So she decides the only way to keep herself safe is to stop being friends with Tommy forever. She won't even talk to him anymore. Which leaves Tommy with a little bit more time to think about his future. Not that he makes use of it. This has been an ongoing question. What the hell do we do with Tommy? because he's not good at school. He's very clever, he's very creative. He has no attention span. His first school teacher insisted he is a remarkable boy, but when asked in what way exactly, she didn't have an answer. Quote, "There was something wonderful about Tommy. You felt it, but you could not quite give it a name." End quote. There has been some hope, given that he has smarts, when he applies himself, that he could pass his exams and qualify for a bursary, which is kind of like a scholarship, and thus be able to go to college. But Aaron has declared that, should he fail, that is his own damn fault, and Aaron will not be sponsoring any apprenticeships for any skilled trades. If not college, Tommy will be sent off to the herding. So he should be studying. And he tries, quote, "He did his very best, doggedly, wearily, sitting at the round table, till Elspeth feared that he was killing himself, and gave him a melancholy comfort by saying so. An hour afterwards he might discover that he had been far away from his books, looking on at his affecting death, and counting the mourners at the funeral." End quote. His current teacher, Mr. Cathrow's only hope that he passes the exams is that maybe, because it's Tommy, there is always, quote, "the possibility of his diddling the examiners," end quote, which, not in the, "Hey, Professor, is there any way I could do some extra credit, wink wink, nudge nudge sort of way, but in the to cheat or deceive sort of way. The word diddle appeared 7 times in this book, and it delighted me every time. My favorite was, quote, "to be diddled by a girl when one flatters himself he is diddling," end quote. Oh, I'm easily amused. He doesn't diddle his examiners, and does in fact fail his exams, and so should be screwed. But he gets a second chance. There's an essay competition for local boys with prize money for whoever manages the best essay written in the Scots tongue. Tommy has actually proved himself a decent writer. He's had a side hustle lately, writing letters on behalf of other people, and he does this quite well. His most consistent talent throughout his life has always been, quote, "stepping into other people's shoes and remaining there until he became someone else," end quote. He is so fascinated with trying to feel other people's experiences that he once spent like a week trading for the grief of a classmate whose father had just died. The other kid would run around playing with friends, and Tommy would sit off to the side wearing this kid's black jacket, legitimately crying, effectively trying on someone else's mourning just because he wanted to know what it felt like. It's grief that the other kid didn't actually seem to have, given that he would let someone else do it for him, but that is beside the point. Tommy finds himself wishing that there was a way to combine his talents into a career, putting himself into the perspective of others, finally crafting words. It's pretty heavily hinted that he should maybe become an author, but Tommy himself does not figure that out yet. But they know he can write stuff, so they enter him into this essay thing. Quote, "For 2 hours the competitors were put into a small room, and Tommy began at once with a confident smirk," end quote. The judges, listening through the door, gossip amongst themselves about who might win, Tommy or the one other guy, and Tommy is the fan favorite. But when the 2 hours are done and it's time to turn in their work, Tommy, quote, "clung to his papers, crying fiercely that the 2 hours could not be up yet. Unhappy Cathrow tore the essay from Tommy's hands. Essay. It was no more an essay than a twig is a tree, for the gawk had stuck in the middle of his second page. He had brought himself to public scorn for the lack of a word." What word, they asked testily, but even now he could not tell. He had wanted a Scotch word that would signify how many people were in church. Puckle was nearly the word, but it did not mean so many people as he meant. "You little tatty dooley," Cathro roared. "Were there not a dozen words to wile from if you had an ill will to Puckle? What ailed you at Mansie? Or, well, I thought of Mansie, but a Mansie's a swarm. I thought of Mask, but that would mean the kirk was crammed, and I just meant it to be middling full." "Flo would have done," suggested Mr. Lorimer. "Flo's but a handful." "Curran, then, you jackanapes! Curran's not enough!" Mr. Lorimer flung up his hands in despair, end quote, and Tommy is on the verge of tears, and you know what? Relatable. So, having failed twice to earn his way into college, Aaron fulfills his promise and finds Tommy a position with a farmer 15 miles away, which is far enough that Elspeth won't be able to see him easily, and she is so upset and hysterical that they have to call the doctor. The day that he has to leave, she walks with him to the cart he's catching a ride on, and they're both trying to pretend to be happy because they had promised each other that they would. And as the cart carries him away, she stands up on a stone wall and waves until a dip in the road brings him out of sight, and then she sobs the whole way home. Grizzle takes her place up on the wall. She still hasn't been speaking to Tommy, but couldn't resist coming to see him go, as long as he wouldn't know about it. When the cart comes back up into view, Tommy is far enough away that he can't tell she's not Elspeth, so he starts waving again. Quote, "At first she did not respond, but by and by it struck her that he would be more unhappy if he thought Elspeth was too overcome by grief to wave to him. Her arms rocked passionately. No, she would not lift them to wave to him. He could be as unhappy as he chose. Then, in a spirit of self-abnegation that surely raised her high among the daughters of men, though she was but a painted lady's child, she waved to him to save him the pain, and he waved back until nothing could be seen by either of them save wood and fields and a long deserted road." End quote. That is the end of the book, which I will say I was not thrilled with that ending. It feels like a very incomplete story, and I think that's because it is. There's a sequel called Tommy and Grizzle that I hope contains somewhat more closure. I did find a review of Sentimental Tommy from the December 1896 issue of the Bookman magazine. Quote, "Now he who undertakes to dramatize the thoughts, dreams, speculations, impulses, innocences, and unmoralities of childhood has before him a very trying enterprise. Though we have all been children, we are strange to childhood. The novelist of Thrums has made it his business to show the working of the young, unchastened, unformed, and forming elements of individual character. Now, rightly enough, Tommy's biographer makes a point of including all the boy's little vices and weaknesses, but not, I think, with fortunate results. There are various kinds of childish imperfection, and the faults attributed to Tommy would be nicer if they were ruder. They are not nice faults, nor of those that are most likely to rub off. The truth is, I suppose, that they could not be other than they are, yet I can but wish that a different choice had been possible, for they expose him to the risk of downright dislike." End quote. I mostly follow that, but I will be honest, he would be more likable if he was more rude. Kind of a weird statement. I feel like this has to be rude as in kind of rough and simple, rather than impolite. The reviewer finds Elspeth a little bare bones, but with potential for the sequel, and Grizzle's character to be a very strong point. However, quote, "Except as a means of bringing Grizzle forward, there is no use for the painted lady, and no pleasure in her. An entirely artificial personage, not unlike one of the worst conceptions of Charles Dickens. Here, however, I must stop with a word for the many humorous turns and touches that stud the pages of Sentimental Tommy, and for the remarkably close and careful workmanship in the writing thereof. Frederick Greenwood." End quote. And as is often the case, I both agree and disagree with Frederick. Like him, I also preferred the first portion of the book to the second, though my reasons sometimes differ. He found the scenes surrounding their mother, her past and present, to be some of the most impactful, and with that I would agree. I was often wishing that the second half of the book would grip me as much as the first had. It just felt a lot more meandering and fluffy. Not without charm, just less meat. But I don't dislike the second half more because of anything wrong with Tommy. I think he is often dislikable. I think he is like that through all of the book, and I don't think that's wholly unintentional. He's a little shit. Tale as old as childhood. The parts of the latter half that I did like best, though, were the ones surrounding the painted lady, and her relationship with Grizzle, and the impact her failing health and death had on her child. She is kind of more a silhouette of a character than a character. I think this is understandable, given that due to her waning lucidity, she is probably a hollow caricature of the person she used to be. I agree that her best utility is in highlighting Grizzle, but I didn't find her existence worthy of, disdain. Overall, I enjoyed a lot of the writing style. I found a lot of elements charming. The plot interest was slight. Somebody else described it that way in the Bookman. It is a lot of unrelated, kind of pointless adventures of a kid who kind of sucks, and that was sometimes tiresome. But also, when you put it that way, honestly, I'm just all the more impressed that I had as many good thoughts as I did. So with that, I hope I will catch you in the next one, and in the meantime you can catch me at Yobbpod, Yobbpod, on the social media platform of your choice, probably. And for today's life advice from the past, don't sleep with men, you'll die.